Hey guys, and welcome to another episode in a video series presented and funded by KupoCon, where I'll be exploring the Final Fantasy VII compilation lore and Easter eggs that appear in the remake. I'm MJ Gallagher, author of The Nibelheim Incident, an award-winning novel and audiobook also produced by KupoCon, as well as my latest release, Norse Myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII. The purpose of this series is to discuss a lot of the detail hidden within Remake, and to provide a broader understanding for new and veteran fans alike. In the last episode, I covered the player character's continued ascent through Shinra headquarters in Chapter 16, itself titled The Belly of the Beast, where I spoke about topics such as Mayor Domino's connection to Avalanche, Hojo and Ifalma's past, the relevance of the Kunso name drop, and the Shinra executive meeting. This time around, I'll be examining the climax of the chapter, set in Professor Hojo's lab. The video will inherently include spoilers for this part of the game, but anything beyond Chapter 16 is minimal and mainly speculation. As always, if you're not familiar with the original Final Fantasy VII, there will very likely be heavy spoilers. And if you're new to the channel, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Having eavesdropped on the executive meeting from the air vents, Cloud, Tifa and Barrett decide to follow Professor Hojo in the hope of finding Aerith. They catch up to him in the vestibule area of the 64th floor, where he is pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. The scientist seems to be very intrigued by the prospect of Sephiroth's return, and even ponders what it might be like to meet the offspring of the former war hero and Aerith. Bear in mind that this scene follows Hojo's update in the conference room that he intends to breed Aerith, the last ancient, with a member of Soldier. Sephiroth, of course, was considered the perfect soldier prior to his death, not to mention the fact he is Hojo's biological son. And if that wasn't twisted or narcissistic enough, let's not forget that Aerith's father was Professor Gast, the same Gast that was Hojo's superior during the Genova project, the scientist whom Sephiroth respected in his youth while he loathed Hojo, and the man Hojo murdered at Icicle Inn to capture Aerith and Ifalma as research specimens in the first place. On a more abstract level, in both the original Final Fantasy VII and Advent Children, Sephiroth is closely associated with Genova, while Aerith is a champion of the planet, two entities that have been in opposition since the meteor struck 2,000 years ago. To have Aerith and Sephiroth reproduce would be the final nail in the Cetra's coffin. It's also not the first time a similar idea has been pitched. As I spoke about way back in my Chapter 2 episode of this series, the Ultimania Omega reveals early concepts from the old game's script. One was that Aerith and Sephiroth should be brother and sister, while another was to involve them in a subplot about unrequited love. Sephiroth would supposedly come and buy flowers from Aerith on the plate, but would never reciprocate her romantic feelings towards him. Chasing after the scientist, the trio find themselves in the sub-level of Hojo's lab, wandering between rooms filled with surgery chairs and Mako capsules. It's all a bit creepy, with the eerie green colour scheme of the Mako tanks in particular being deliberately reminiscent of the Shinra Manor basement, where Cloud spent 4 years in a comatose state. The party catches up to Hojo and forces him to access the main research floor of the sub-level. The scientist deduces that they are Avalanche, then says he can't imagine what they would want with him. This is curious because he has been approached by Avalanche before, right here in his laboratory, no less. During Chapter 10 of Before Crisis, Fujito, one of the leaders of the old militant organisation, persuades Hojo to leave the Shinra building with him, promising him unlimited funding and exciting new specimens to test. In the end, Sephiroth brings down their helicopter and Hojo decides to remain with Shinra to continue his study of the legendary soldier, his son. Unlike the original Final Fantasy VII, where the Professor remotely transports sample Ho-512 to the floor above, once the group has rescued Aerith, he unleashes the monstrous fiend on the party here. Just as in that battle, Ho-512 is accompanied by the smaller OPT enemies, which respawn throughout the fight if killed. In Remake, however, the respawn has them being spat out by the hideous maw on the monster's right shoulder. It's clear from this area of the sub-level that Ho-512, which is presumably shorthand for Hojo Specimen 512, is the only one of its kind in the immediate vicinity. However, in Chapter 22 of Before Crisis, which takes place a couple of months before Final Fantasy VII, the player Turk has to battle their way through a number of these brutes, released in the laboratory to slow the player down. It could be that this sample is an evolution of those enemies, or is quite simply the only one left. The design of the monster is of particular interest too. To begin with, Remake's version of Ho-512 includes far more emphasis on tentacles, specifically purple tentacles, and has a human-like skull on half its face. The tentacles are less prominent in the original game, while the skull itself is difficult to see. Curiously though, both can be found on the Genova Dreamweaver lifeform that is encountered in the next chapter. Even more curiously, very similar aesthetics feature on the Heretic Hojo boss in the old game, incorrectly translated as Helitic Hojo, after the Professor injects himself with Genova cells, as well as the diabolic creation of Remake's episode Intermission, which is described as a man-made monstrosity created by Hojo's department. As a side note, the diabolic creation was originally called Heretic Rayleigh in Japan, very likely a reference to the Shinra scientist encountered in Before Crisis. In short, it's no coincidence that these abominations all share common traits, because they each have almost certainly been mutated by Genova cells. As we'll discover in Chapter 17, Professor Hojo's laboratory is basically one big testing site for Genova's effects on other creatures. After the battle, there is a minor nod to the original Final Fantasy VII, in that the player can examine the glass cell containing Red XIII. The party don't make any remarks about him this time around, but it's fun to see nonetheless. Ascending to the main level of the laboratory, the group finds Hojo and a squad of armoured troopers waiting for them. The scientist reveals he has used the combat data from their previous fight to gauge their strength. This ties in with what Chadley has been doing since Chapter 3, but is also reminiscent of Crisis Core, where the player could visit Hojo in the laboratory to have Zack participate in battle experiments in order to provide the desired data. When the party dispatches the opponents, Hojo seems perplexed, deliberating whether there may have been an unknown variable in his predictive model. The unknown variable is of course Cloud, because Hojo has not accounted for him having the strength of a soldier. Asking Cloud directly about this jogs Hojo's memory, and he outright tells the blonde hero that he wasn't a soldier. The scientist recognising him here is a far more logical approach than in the original game, because it's not likely Hojo would be unfamiliar with the grunt that killed Sephiroth. However, it does create a minor problem, because doubt wasn't previously cast over Cloud's past, until much later in the story. To do so now runs the risk of accelerating Cloud's mental breakdown. In acknowledgement of this, the Whispers appear and whisk Hojo away before he can say any more. The confusion is broken by Aerith's shouts, and Barrett frees her by shooting the electronic lock of her cell, just as in the old game. We also see this short-circuit the door to Red XIII's prison below. The fiery beast escapes and leaps up the pipes to where the others are, growling at them before setting off after Hojo. While this does seem to be a pretty different introduction from the original Final Fantasy VII, Red XIII does behave aggressively towards Aerith when he is first brought to her container, albeit he later claims he was acting. The group follows the creature and they arrive in time to see him miss out on catching the Professor, whose dazed state is something I'll talk about in the next video. Red XIII then turns and approaches the party, causing Barrett to ready his gun arm. Aerith intervenes and tells him that this child is a friend. This is yet another example of her having knowledge of the future, because A, he does become a dear comrade, and B, despite Red XIII's aged appearance and wise persona, it is later discovered that he is the human equivalent of a teenager, because his species have exceptionally long lifespans. As we saw in Chapter 12 with Marlene, Aerith calms Red XIII by coming into close contact with him, creating a type of clairvoyant connection between the two. The screen turns green for a moment, a colour that typically symbolises Mako or spirit energy, and golden sparkles effervesce around Aerith's palm. I'll come back to the importance of this in a minute. The party are stunned, of course, when Red XIII first speaks, and a version of the iconic line, "I am what you see," makes a grand return. He asks that the group leave it at that, which may be a meta-allusion to the fact that his species has never been given an official name in the compilation. It's not even conclusive whether he is canine or feline. For example, Advent Children and its promotional artwork emphasised the feline link he shared with the robotic cat Kate Sith, while Reno describes Red XIII in Before Crisis as resembling a mountain lion. However, in the official novel The Kids Are Alright, the lead character initially thinks Red XIII is a dog or wolf. I think the fairest answer is, he's a bit of both. As a side note, when Tifa says 13 in reference to his tattoo, the beast pauses for a second before sitting on his haunches. Veteran fans may recognise the pose as perfectly reflecting Tetsuya Nomura's character artwork from the original Final Fantasy VII. Tifa then goes on to ask Red XIII what his real name is, but he doesn't answer, and instead glances towards the elevator where Hojo escaped. In the old game, it is revealed when the party arrives at Cosmo Canyon that his name is actually Nanaki. In terms of aesthetics, Red XIII appears really quite scrawny, which I guess is hardly surprising given that he has spent a year in captivity at Hojo's lab. For context, Chapter 18 of Before Crisis is set around 14 months prior to the events of Final Fantasy VII. It details how the Turks were originally sent to capture Dinah, Nanaki's female counterpart, because they are an endangered species, but Nanaki eventually agrees to go with them in her place. I'm curious to know if his bulk will change as the story progresses, because he is later capable of carrying humans on his back. Specific instances of this include Yuffie's friend Yuri in On the Way to a Smile, and Kirie Kanan in The Kids Are Alright. It's also worth pointing out that although Red XIII's jewellery and feather accessories remain, his weapon has changed from a hair clip to a collar. In Remake's Ultimania, battle system designer Ryota Iwagami remarked that the developers intended to allow Red XIII to use magic in battle. However, even though he isn't playable in this game, the programming wouldn't allow spellcasting without materia equipped. And when designers tried to deactivate the materia, it automatically disappeared from Red XIII's collar. In the end, they had to keep it, which is why he is in possession of these magic orbs, despite them being something of a security risk to the scientists experimenting on him. To be fair, this does reflect the original game, because Red XIII inexplicably has materia equipped when he joins the party. On the subject of Aerith and Red XIII sharing something clairvoyant, this connects to what I spoke about in my third Chapter 16 video. In short, we should understand strands of spirit energy to be made up of the thoughts, memories and experiences of individuals who have returned to the livestream. This is why spirit energy as a collective is considered to hold the knowledge and wisdom from the past. Though it isn't just the past, because time is measured differently in the livestream, which is referenced in the black and white mini chapters of the book On the Way to a Smile. As was revealed by Remake's co-director Motomu Toriyama in the Material Ultimania Plus, Aerith's communication with the livestream has given her memories of the future. And it is these very memories that she has shared with Red XIII, allowing him to see that they will all become friends, just as Aerith said. When the group's attention returns to Hojo, Barrett asks if they should pursue him, but Cloud is overcome by another of his mental episodes and begins involuntarily staggering towards the elevator. In his mind, he sees flashes of the Genova chamber at the Mount Nebo Mako reactor from 5 years ago, with the track Those Chosen by the Planet playing in the background. This is the same track that's present in the original game, when Cloud confronts Sephiroth in the Genova chamber during his retelling of events. In Remake, as Cloud shuffles down the corridor, Sephiroth's voice can be heard, quoting the lines, "I have come for you. Mother, together we will reclaim our world. Mother, they have come again." These of course are spoken by Sephiroth during that scene at the reactor. What's very curious about that though, is Cloud's memory isn't accurate. He wasn't present when Sephiroth said this. It is only through the power of Genova that Cloud is able to recall someone else's memory, highlighting the extent of the being's control over him. Another really interesting find brought to my attention by my friend and YouTube essayist Sleepeasy is that there's also a harsh, animalistic sound that can be heard behind the music. The only other place in Remake where this sound occurs is during the Genova Dreamweaver battle. Therefore, a strong argument can be made that we are literally hearing the call of Genova. When Cloud touches the elevator doors, the flashback becomes more vivid, and the player is shown the female form of the Genova specimen. Cloud whispers "Mother," which he has never done before, though Kadaj does call Genova the mother of Cloud in Advent Children. I wonder if this is also a concept that will be pushed onto the robed Sephiroth clones in future parts of Remake. The chapter draws to a conclusion with a scene set in the auditing department of Shinra's General Affairs Division, located on level B3 beneath the company's headquarters. As we can see, this is an office belonging to the Turks. The Turks have played an important role across the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, especially in Before Crisis, where they are the game's protagonists. They have previously been known interchangeably as the Investigative Division of General Affairs, or the Department of Administrative Research, among others. Remake's version is a new one though, and the Material Ultimania does call them the General Affairs Division's Auditing Department. Another new element is the location of this office. The Turks' headquarters is only ever mentioned in Before Crisis, and even then, its whereabouts is top secret, even for the player. Many scenes that take place in Before Crisis suggest it's highly likely HQ was somewhere above the 60th floor of the Shinra building. This is corroborated in the official anime Last Order, where Sung's office has windows that look out over Midgar's plate. That said, towards the end of Before Crisis, the Turks lose favour with President Shinra and the executive. The surviving members only keep their jobs and lives because Rufus Shinra vouches for them, which might explain why their offices have been banished to the basement. An alternative explanation might be, as Vincent and Yuffie discovered during Dirge of Cerberus and episode Intermission respectively, that the basement levels are actually home to some of Shinra's most clandestine departments. Admittedly, the giant screen behind Sung in the auditing office isn't all that dissimilar to the image of Turks HQ in Before Crisis, where Chief Verdot directs the operatives. Just as I mentioned in my Chapter 11 video, Remake is continuing the complex characterisation of the Turks compared to the original game. Reno and Rude show clear signs of guilt and uncertainty, though Sung is more darkly philosophical, specifically regarding how causing tens of thousands of deaths is Shinra's way of giving something back to the planet. Reno's presence here, in other words not in a hospital bed, indicates he's likely to show up early in Part 2 of Remake, rather than be absent for the Mithril Mines encounter. Veteran fans may recall from the old game that Rude tells the group his partner is unfit for duty, due to the injuries they gave him on the Sector 7 pillar. In turn, that raises the question of how Elena will be introduced. While this is something of a minor detail, one of the biggest smiles I had playing Final Fantasy VII Remake was seeing Sung signing documents at his desk. This is a callback to the opening of Last Order, where he is doing exactly the same thing. And finally, Sung, Reno and Rude's conversation is interrupted by a telephone call from the VP, or, to give him his full title, Vice President Rufus Shinra. I touched on this briefly in the previous episode, but towards the climax of Before Crisis, Rufus makes a deal with the Turks to help them save Verdot, their former chief. In return, he asks for their absolute loyalty. This is the real reason he intervenes at the executive meeting to decide the Turks' fate, and personally vouches for them. Although they officially answer to Director Heidegger, Rufus now has full control of the Turks. What's especially interesting about this is that A, the Turks are already fully aware of Rufus's ties to Avalanche, and B, the executive meeting in question takes place only hours before Cloud & Co. bomb Mako Reactor 1. So this working arrangement, which is seen going strong in Advent Children, On the Way to a Smile, and The Kids Are Alright, is still in its infancy. It seems clear to me that we should expect the Remake project to explore the dynamics of this relationship in greater depth than the compilation ever has before. Well folks, this has been my recap of the compilation lore and Easter eggs from the final part of Chapter 16. I hope you enjoyed it, and please be sure to leave a comment with any feedback or something you think I've missed. If you haven't already done so, I invite you to check out my Patreon account, where you'll find free downloads of my unofficial novelisation of Final Fantasy VII, the Nibelheim Incident, and so much more. Subscribers also get access to a huge amount of original content as well, including project artwork, behind the scenes podcasts, on mythology and Final Fantasy articles, etc. And please consider picking up a copy of my book, Norse Myths That Inspired Final Fantasy VII, which is now also available as an audiobook and special edition hardback. The links to each edition can be found on my Patreon, the address for which is noted at the end of this video. I would additionally like to thank KupoCon for commissioning the series and encourage all viewers to support their channel and the brand. But until next time, take care. I'm MJ Gallagher, and I'll speak to you again soon.